Good evening and welcome to Viewpoint. The UK and Spain reached an agreement in principle over Gibraltar's future relationship with the EU on New Year's Eve. The Chief Minister said this would be the beginning of the creation of an area of shared prosperity. The UK Foreign Secretary said British sovereignty is safeguarded. Spain's Foreign Minister said it was a time of hope and the start of a new relationship. A period of 6 months was set for the treaty to be finalised, at which point, if agreed, it would be signed into international law. Before then, Fabian Picardo is live in the studio with us to answer your questions about it. Good evening, Chief Minister.
Good evening, Jonathan.
To explain to our TV audience, I should not pose a risk to you because I've already had COVID-19 in late November and I'm assumed to have 6 months of immunity. But we have nevertheless taken the precaution of myself wearing the mask and asking our camera operators to set up the cameras but then not be in the studio with us. But let's get on with it because we've got plenty of questions. We're going to go to us, I should say, viewpoint@gbc.gi if you want to ask yours. We'll try and get through them. We've already got a lot of questions that have come in. But let's go straight to our first one, which comes from the Chamber of Commerce and Christian Hernandez.
Chief Minister, following on from the announcement of the in principle arrangement in relation to Schengen and various press reports on a potential customs union arrangement and your announcement on the creation of a TLAC advisory committee to government on business opportunities arising out of these arrangements, I would be grateful if we could have an indication of where you think, in what sectors you think these business opportunities will arise and where you see Gibraltar's economy in 4 years' time. Thank you very much.
Chief Minister.
Thank you very much. And first of all, Jonathan, can I start by thanking you for the arrangements that have been made this afternoon or this evening for me to be in the studio and for me not to be able to wear a mask so that everybody can see more clearly what I'm saying, and in particular to camera colleagues who would usually be with us this evening and have left the studio for this purpose. So Christian's question is an important one. He's the President of the Chamber of Commerce and rightly he's concentrating on where our future business opportunities lie. Look, we've got to look very carefully at what it is that the framework agreement says to understand where it is that we might go, and might is an important part of this because the framework talks about what could, not will, be in this treaty, where we could be in the context of the arrangements that we might agree for the new goods chapter that we might agree for this part of the treaty. Now, in 1972, when the IWBP and the AACR were the leading parties in the Parliament with the IWBP, they determined that taking the advice of the United Kingdom and staying out of the Common Customs Union was the right thing for Gibraltar. And I have no doubt that that was, in fact, the right decision in 1972. Today, we have to make a different decision, and this is the opportunity that is there for us to make a decision to take some part of what is known as the customs acquis, to have a bespoke arrangement, which is what the framework talks about, which will create new business opportunities for Gibraltar. What those are is actually what TLAC is about. I want to consult widely with the business community here. We have to determine together whether it makes sense for us to pursue this part of what is proposed, or whether it actually makes more sense for us in the creation of the area of shared prosperity that we want to all see happen, that we should stay outside of those arrangements. But of course, then the question is, coming to mobility, if you've done arrangements which relate to immigration and Schengen, but you haven't done arrangements which relate to customs, you might still have a barrier which could create queues, etc., and restrict mobility, which is a customs barrier. And the question is the business opportunity better created by not having that customs barrier between us, or is it better protected by having that customs barrier between us? And this is what I look forward to engaging with the business community on in Gibraltar. I have my own ideas, my government has its own ideas, and we have our own reservations and concerns also.
But could one go ahead without the other?
Well, this is exactly what the framework agreement says. If you look at the framework, paragraph 5, which deals with mobility, it talks about...
The framework hasn't officially been published yet, has it?
Well, but it has been published by a Spanish newspaper, and everyone in Gibraltar, I think, has now got access to it. I've provided a copy of it to the opposition and to Ms. Malin Hassan Naon. So if you look at paragraph 5, it talks about what will be in this agreement, if there is one, which is a matter relating to immigration and Schengen mobility. And then in paragraph 11, I believe, it talks about, which is the good section, it talks about what could be in the treaty as well. So one is something that we have agreed we will do, and the other is something we might want to pursue. That's why we're using the could there.
Okay, and we'll return to the issue of customs, but I just wanted to point out for our viewers that there have been different opinions on how good or beneficial a customs union could be for Gibraltar, expressed by your two predecessors. Sir Peter Caruana thinks that it might be a good idea because we would, I think, enjoy the full benefits of the free mobility that Schengen would afford us. And on the other hand, Sir Joe Bossano has expressed significant concerns about what it would mean for our economic model.
That's right. And really, both are setting out what the alternatives that we have to consider here are. Maximum fluidity, as I've said, or protection through customs protection still remain, customs checks still remaining. Look, Sir Joe speaks for the government. This is the concern that we have all shared in Cabinet. We have to be very careful in understanding whether this is opportunity or potential danger for the Gibraltar economy. And this is an analysis that we have to do together. Joe is right to be cautious about these things. He was probably the only person who was in the Parliament in 1972 when the original decision was made. Therefore, his input on this is more than just important, it's essential. And the input of members of the Chamber and of the Federation of Small Businesses, and indeed the unions on this, will be fundamental too.
Okay, you mentioned the unions. Let's hear from the first one who's asking a question tonight, Gillian Burkett, on behalf of Unite the Union.
Good evening. Chief Minister, Unite would like to understand how government, under the new treaty, intends to keep a level playing field with regards to the ability of companies registered in Spain to freely come into Gibraltar unchecked and registered, and with their diminished terms and conditions of employment, to offer works at prices that local companies may not be able to compete with, as this could have serious consequences on our members employed within small businesses. And secondly, Chief Minister, Unite would like to seek further clarity as to how the use of Frontex will affect employment conditions, workload and manning levels of Borders and Coast Guard Agency, Gibraltar Airport staff, HM Customs and of the Gibraltar Port Authority. All currently have responsibility of areas where Frontex would potentially be deployed to man. Thank you.
Chief Minister.
Thank you. So that's two questions really from Gillian. I'll take the first one first. How are we going to protect Gibraltar businesses from a potential influx of businesses from across the frontier? Well, the reality is that this is a question that the Chamber and the Federation often ask, even today, as a result of the fact that we have the reality of Spanish businesses operating in Gibraltar and in many instances not properly registering and therefore not complying with, as Gillian properly refers to it, with the level playing field in Gibraltar. And I think what these new arrangements might potentially do, because we still have to negotiate the treaty, and because of the nature of Gibraltar, we will potentially be able to be more vigilant about these things and actually provide additional protection to ensure that those who are coming into Gibraltar might no longer be checked for immigration purposes, might no longer be checked for customs purposes, depending on the deal we do, are checked in a different way to ensure that if they're operating in Gibraltar, and why would a plumber drive into Gibraltar? Why would an electrician drive into Gibraltar? If they are coming into Gibraltar, are they properly registered with the ETB? Are they registered with the income tax department, etc.? Because, of course, even now, between, for example, France and Germany, where you have no customs border and you have no immigration border, if a French company goes into Germany to do any work, they must still register for German taxation, for all German purposes, and vice versa. That's not happening today between Gibraltar and Spain, even before the 31st of December when we were in the European Union. So we have to ensure that if we have the freedom now to do these things, we escalate the way that we deal with the non-immigration, non-customs aspects of movement across the frontier, which we will be freer to do. The second point which Gillian raises, which I fully understand coming from the Union, is what's going to happen to those agencies that will work potentially alongside Frontex if Frontex comes into Gibraltar on the basis set out in the framework if we have a treaty by the end of June. And look, there I've been very clear in saying that I think that the Gibraltar Borders and Coast Guard Agency, for example, will be for Gibraltar not just the lead agency, but an agency of which Gibraltar will be proud. And I hope that Europe will see that the Gibraltar Borders and Coast Guard Agency is a match for the European Borders and Coast Guard Agency, which is the full name of Frontex. Now, in terms of those who are operating at the airport, Frontex is only going to be operating at the border with the BCA. And at the port, it will also be operating only in relation to border controls, the Schengen checks as they're called, alongside the BCA. But what I would expect is that we would see much more air traffic into Gibraltar if we are able to finalise these arrangements, and the terms and conditions of those who will be involved in delivering that for the government of Gibraltar, for the Gibraltar authorities, where we have checks, etc., will not suffer at all. If anything, people know that in the time that I've been in government, we've protected those terms and conditions and enhanced them.
We received dozens of emails ahead of starting tonight's programme. I've printed out most of them for ease of reference. I'm going to pick up two which reflect some of what you've said there, or perhaps probe it a little further. Sean wants to know where you see the Borders and Coast Guard Agency in 5 years' time. Will they continue doing what they currently do? And Glynis is asking, if we have an open frontier, will we have more undesirables, as she puts it, coming into Gibraltar? Would you expect crimes like burglaries to increase, and will Gibraltar be less of a safe haven?
So let me take those two in turn. The first, in relation to the Borders and Coast Guard Agency, I see the Borders and Coast Guard Agency entrenching itself and being an even more important agency than it is today. And today it's fundamental, of course, but as you look at how our airport might develop, or the opportunities at our port might develop, the Borders and Coast Guard Agency becomes a much more important agency because those entry points become much more important for Gibraltar. And I have said repeatedly that I bet on the professionalism of the men and women of the Borders and Coast Guard Agency to, in 5 years, have done Gibraltar proud, and for the Europeans to be looking at the Gibraltarians and saying, those guys can do this job just as well or better than we can, because they know this place much better than we can. In the context of Gibraltar's safety and security, look, as I've often said, the safety and security of Gibraltar is the first duty for the government. The protection of that safety and security is the first duty for the government. The one thing that is not going to change is the geography of Gibraltar. And indeed, if finally the airport tunnel is finished, we will have an entry for vehicles into Gibraltar which is much more controllable. The frontier will still be there. It's not as if we're going to have many more opportunities for access to Gibraltar. You'll still be able to walk in only through the area that you can walk in now. You'll only be able to drive in through the area that you can drive in now. So Gibraltar is a funnel, and the control of Gibraltar, whether it's at the frontier or indeed at the airport or port, will constantly, as it is happening in the rest of the world, evolve electronically. So what I expect we will have is much more accurate facial recognition technology, much more accurate number plate recognition technology, the ability to deal with those people who we might not like, not just at the border, but at the entrance to the tunnel and the exit to the tunnel. If we're able to secure walking across the runway, then also as you access the runway. So expect to see much more technology deployed, and expect Gibraltar therefore to be much, much safer than it is today. My children are my main concern, of course, as you can imagine, as a parent, as I'm sure yours are for you. I don't want people roaming around Gibraltar who might be a danger to my children or the children of anybody else more in the future than they are today, and I don't even want them here today. Okay. So Gibraltar is going to be more of a fortress going forward than it is today.
Does increased technology mean less of dependence on people doing jobs? Does technology take the place of jobs?
Certainly not, because cameras can't arrest people. Cameras don't make the final decision. Cameras tell us, using algorithms, that somebody may be on a database, but cameras don't tell us that the behaviour of an individual may be right or not be right. And for that, we need our police officers, we need our BCA officers, our customs officers observing and making human decisions about how somebody is behaving or how somebody looks.
Frontex and the role that they will play alongside the Border and Coast Guard Agency has been a talking point. I should say that, of course, although the deal was announced on the 31st of December, the detail hasn't yet been published officially. It has been leaked by a Spanish newspaper. A lot of people have read it. But it's been a talking point, Frontex, so we've got a few questions on that. Let's go to the first, which was submitted in video form by Brian Cardona.
Good evening, Chief Minister. Brian Cardona. First and foremost, I would like to say that you have my complete support in the Brexit negotiations, because I know that you, like any other Gibraltar politicians, have the best interest of Gibraltar at heart. However, I have three questions by way of clarification. The first one is, it is obvious that anybody coming into Gibraltar would first have to go through Gibraltar passport control. However, from the following three categories of people who would in addition also require to go through Schengen border control. The first one is a resident of Gibraltar who is returning to Gibraltar from being on holiday overseas. The second one is a Gibraltarian who is no longer a resident of Gibraltar but wishes to come to Gibraltar to spend time with relatives here on the Rock. And the third one is a British citizen who lives elsewhere and is coming to Gibraltar from being on holiday. My second question is, if a Gibraltarian who is living outside Gibraltar wishes to return to Gibraltar to live permanently, would they, or indeed any other member of their family who may not be Gibraltarian, require any approval in any way, shape or form from the European Union? And my final question is, will there be any Spanish nationals who will form part of the Frontex border force, who will be on duty at the airport or at the port itself?
Three questions from Brian.
Okay, so I remember Brian, when he was the clerk to the magistrates, made my life just as difficult as he's made it now with so much detail. So I'm going to try and go through each of the details that he's asked me about in each of the questions. So in respect of the three categories that Brian has mentioned, who should be arriving at Gibraltar, all of whom would be British citizens, because it's two categories of Gibraltarians and one British citizen on holiday. None of those would ever require a visa to enter the Schengen area. They're not visa requiring third country nationals. All of access into Gibraltar for those who are resident in Gibraltar will not require Schengen clearance. There will not be any stamping of passports or anything like that. If you wanted to come just into Gibraltar, it is possible under the existing visa regulation. If you look at the visa regulation, Regulation 25 from memory, I think it is, actually even permits permission to be granted not for entry to Schengen, but for entry just to one part of Schengen. So let me give you a non-controversial example. Italy can grant a Schengen visa, which means that you can visit the whole of the Schengen territory, or Italy can grant a visa just for Italy. But then that can only be done on the basis of the national interest or on the basis of international legal obligation or humanitarian grounds. But we could permit somebody just to come into Gibraltar. I want to make that abundantly clear. In terms of residence in Gibraltar, that is a matter exclusively for Gibraltar. Only Gibraltar will make decisions about residence. The key factor here is that there have been some instances in the European Union where some member states have sold passports and residence, and so there is now an adherence to a European code to prevent that. The European Commission has investigated those member states and made findings against that, and that's why there is a standard as to residence, which is about connection with Gibraltar or with the territory. Gibraltar has never granted residence on the basis of anything other than connection with the territory. Even those who might have what is known as Category 2 status are required to have a property for their exclusive use in Gibraltar for 365 days a year. So I think that deals with the point that Brian was raising. If a Gibraltarian wants to return to Gibraltar to live, therefore, just like any other individual who might be granted residence in Gibraltar, whether or not his other relatives are also registered Gibraltarians, we don't require permission from any Spaniard whatsoever, if that is the point that that Brian was making so explicitly. What we will do is, of course, that we will be using the Schengen databases in our checking as well to ensure that there is no one there who is wanted for a criminal offence or known to European intelligence. And that and the Interpol database that we use today will be almost identical when it comes to that information. And finally, whether or not there will be Spanish nationals in Frontex. And Brian has been very careful, as usual, in the way that he's structured his question. He has rightly asked me about Spanish nationals, not about Spanish law enforcement agents, because we're talking about the Frontex statutory core. Now, if you look at the regulation that establishes Frontex, this is regulation from memory 2019, 1896, 2019/1896. At page 101, I think the annexes start, and page 101 to 108 set out the proportions of the recruitment of Frontex agents and therefore what each member state is able to provide in respect of Frontex. So I don't know the numbers exactly, but if you look at the 20-odd member states, you have the equivalent of weighted voting and qualified majority voting in the European Union. So these are people who are employed directly as European civil servants. They're not Guardia Civil seconded, Policía Nacional seconded, or SPA seconded. They are individuals who apply to the European Commission to become members of Frontex. And then what we've said is that we would accept only the proportion that you would expect would form part of the whole representation of the Schengen area.
Okay. We've got a few related questions, Chief Minister, so I'm going to try to the greatest extent possible to just get through them.
That was a very long question from Brian.
They were indeed. There were 3 questions, I suppose, or 4 even, maybe 5. An anonymous caller earlier wanted to, somebody who wanted to remain anonymous, wanted me to ask you whether the visa regime, which is flexible in the EU and can be tweaked, he says, is it possible that we are going to have to align with Spain's version of the visa regime?
Not at all. I think what you're looking at there is that you've got to understand that this is not Gibraltar applying the Schengen visa regime. This is Gibraltar applying its own visa regime for its border, and then subsequently you're going to the Schengen border, and there you're meeting a Schengen visa regime. And as long as you comply with the Schengen visa regime, there's no question of you having to comply with a national visa regime. Gibraltar's visa regime will continue to be the one that the government of Gibraltar sets, which today is very much in line with the Schengen visa regime. You should know, for example, that one of the ways that we permit people into Gibraltar who would otherwise require a visa for Gibraltar, because our visa requirements are sometimes just as tough as the Europeans, for example, now is we say, and this is in the legislation, people will have seen it, we introduced it, if you have a Schengen multiple entry visa, then you are permitted to enter Gibraltar without a Gibraltar visa, but for a maximum of 21 days. So already there is great alignment between us and the Europeans on these issues. Gibraltar will retain its visa issuing provisions. The first border is the Gibraltar border, and if you don't comply with our visa regime, if you're a third country visa requiring national, then you won't cross that Gibraltar border.
Can Gibraltar say yes, but Frontex say no?
It is possible that, we're talking about fairly academic situations, but it is possible that Gibraltar might say yes and Frontex might say no. And in that situation, Gibraltar can grant exceptionally, under Article 25 of the visa regulation, a Gibraltar-only visa. So you are not permitted into the Schengen area. You might be permitted into Gibraltar on humanitarian grounds, on the grounds of national interest, or because of international obligation. But then you would not be able to exit Gibraltar, and the technology would tell us if you exited Gibraltar. And indeed, if you exited Gibraltar into Spain and you were found in Spain in a traffic accident, some other incident with the police, or you sought somehow to have official assistance in Spain, you would be found to be illegally in Spain. But this is very much for the treaty. This is not agreed, and we'll have to see whether we set out specific provisions in the treaty or whether we import wholesale the Schengen visa regulation regime, which in Article 35 provides for this, or some other mechanism is provided for.
Just to refresh our memories, what you have agreed so far is an agreement in principle, a framework on which you are going to try to build a treaty that would become international law should the UK and the EU, and obviously Gibraltar and Spain, be satisfied with that.
Yes, that's a broad summary. That's absolutely right. This is an agreement to seek a treaty. This agreement also talks about other agreements. It talks about a trilateral political instrument that will be done before the treaty, That's important. A trilateral political instrument that will be done before the treaty, and also bilateral arrangements, but not bilateral of the sort that Gibraltar has always disliked between the United Kingdom and Spain in respect of Gibraltar. This is bilateralism between Spain and Gibraltar, and that's already provided for in the framework. I think a step forward in understanding that we have to work together to bring about this area of shared prosperity, and that Spain recognises the Gibraltar authorities as the competent authorities to do things in and around Gibraltar.
So a step forward in respect of sovereignty claims.
Except, of course, all parties have put aside the issue of sovereignty coming to the table, and then in the structure of the agreement, it's specifically said in two places that this is without prejudice to our positions to sovereignty.
But that hasn't stopped you saying that it is good for Gibraltar's position on the isthmus, for example.
It is de facto a reality.
Yes. Let's stick with Frontex if we can. This should be an easy one. Would Frontex guards be armed whilst on duty in Gibraltar?
So this is something for the treaty, of course, but you've got to understand the deployment of Frontex guard would be principally at the airport and then at the port and marinas. At the airport, what you're going to be doing is seeing people come off an aircraft and seeing people go onto an aircraft. People who are coming on and off an aircraft have been checked for security purposes and do not pose a threat in the sense that they cannot be armed. So the position that the government of Gibraltar will be taking, which I think is the position that most Gibraltarians would want to see, is that Gibraltar law would authorise Frontex individuals, Frontex members of the statutory corps, to be armed only on the authority of the Commissioner of Police, when the Commissioner of Police decides that they should be armed, in the same way as the Commissioner of Police decides when police officers should be armed in the event that there is an emergency or in the event that there is intelligence to suggest that it is necessary for the protection of the civilian population that they should be armed. They would otherwise not, in the government of Gibraltar's view, be permitted to be armed, and that is what our legislation, which I would envisage after the treaty, would provide for.
OK, I should thank Tito for that question. Thank you if you've taken a moment to send in a question via the email viewpoint@gbc.gi. We're trying to get through as many of them as possible between now and 11 p.m. with the Chief Minister. Staying with Frontex, Lewis asks, where exactly would they operate? Who will these officers, who will they answer to in respect of command and deployment? And will the BCA be the leading authority in these matters?
So there'll be two authorities, I suppose, which will be the leading authorities in respect of these matters, which will be the Borders and Coast Guard Agency, because they will be the ones who will be in place at the airport and who will be deployed with Frontex in moving around Gibraltar to the port and to the marinas. Of course, it is also possible that there could be a police officer involved. The police officers also have powers in respect of immigration, and if there are sensitive cases, then the police could also be involved. Frontex will be in communication with the Spanish authorities as the Schengen authorities, because they will have responsibility as regards the European Union, as is set out in the framework agreement, for the Schengen checks. And so they will be in communication with the Schengen authorities, who will be checking the Schengen information system. And so BCA will be checking passports against Gibraltar databases, as could the police in certain instances, as happens today, because the police also have that power. And Frontex will be checking those passports using probably mobile devices against the Schengen information system, which will be maintained by the member state Spain, which is the way that the Schengen information system is deployed around the European Union in each of the Schengen states.
OK, this is one of several questions submitted by Janito Politics, a Facebook group by a person who wanted to remain anonymous. Minister Sir Joe Bossano said to GBC that an office on the Spanish side of the border would host a Border and Coast Guard officer, a Frontex agent, and also a Spanish officer to allow access to non-Schengen citizens, and their passports would be stamped there by a Spanish officer as needed. Does that mean that UK nationals coming into Gibraltar would have to have their passports stamped by a Spanish authority at this new office?
No, I think what Joe explained is that you've got the, and we're still subject to treaty, but this is what the parties have envisaged in the context of going to seek the treaty. You've got the passport control by the Gibraltar authorities, manned by the BCA, the primary and first key into access to Gibraltar. Then behind that, you've got the Frontex control, also in the airport, because we're really principally talking about the airport here, not the port. If you have no difficulties, if you're a non-visa requiring national, third country national, UK national, you're going through those controls, If you have a problem with the Schengen check, that's when you'll need to be taken to the office that will be built adjacent to the airport, which will be equidistantly in Spain and in Gibraltar. And there it's where your secondary checks will be carried out. And there is where, if necessary, where you will get the stamp, if stamping is required for you as a national of a third country, to be able to enter the Schengen territory. That is not what would happen at the Frontex desk. The Gibraltar authorities would carry out secondary checks elsewhere. So today, if somebody turns up and their passport is checked, but a BCA officer feels that they need to be asked questions or feels that they need to be further interrogated, that doesn't happen at the passport desk. They would be taken somewhere else for that conversation. This is the place where those checks would be carried out, those secondary checks if you haven't passed passport control and there's a concern about you.
In respect of this concern about what control Spain might have, if any, as a result of this agreement, Francis asks a very broad question. Yeah. Would Gibraltar come under Spain's responsibility for anything as a result of this deal?
Absolutely not. And look, the thing that we've got to understand here is that what Spain will be responsible for is what she is responsible for today. So today, if somebody from Gibraltar Airport or from Gibraltar Port wants to access the Schengen area, you hit that Schengen control at the land frontier between Gibraltar and Spain. And so, as we have left the European Union, that would become a much more stringent check than it has been to date, because we would now manifest as third country nationals. So what Spain's control has been at the land frontier is the only thing that will come to the control of the Schengen border at the airport, but Spain will not exercise that at the airport. Spain will exercise it where necessary in these secondary checks in this new office that will be built straddling the border equidistantly into Spain and Gibraltar. And principally, there will be BCA officers, RGP officers, Spanish officers and Frontex officers for these secondary checks as may be required. Now, today, you've got 15 million people coming into Gibraltar a year, 15 million people going out. Spain carries out 30 million checks. Those 30 million checks will be much more rigorous after we leave the European Union. In fact, we've now left, but in fact, if we haven't even got these bridging measures that we have today whilst we wait for the treaty. But instead of those 30 million checks, they will have the checks at the airport and the checks at the port for Schengen through Frontex.
Okay. Who would pay for this new building?
So this is an issue that has to be resolved in the
confirmed.
European Union. Look, we've got to be clear about one thing. I'm always going to be very sceptical about the suggestion that the European Commission might pay for something, because I still remember when we were told that they were going to pay for half of the cost of the airport building, and we haven't yet received the check. Right. So we'll have to see whether that is a shared cost between Gibraltar and Spain, whether it's something that the European Commission wants to stamp up with, or whether it's something that the three of us do together.
Okay. Julie asks a question which, again, addresses this concern about what control Spain might have. You've addressed it in the 4 years that the treaty envisages. Julie's question is, what happens after the 4-year period? Would Spain take over from Frontex, as the Spanish foreign minister has suggested?
So that is the position of Spain. Spain's position is...
That's what she wants.
That's right. That Spain's position is that after those 4 years, they should take over the operation of the checks. The position that my government has put is that that is not acceptable to us now, or in 4 years' time, or in 40 years' time. The Spanish say, look, can we please build confidence with you? Can we show you that the fears you have about Spain are unfounded, and you should accept a Spanish police officer at Gibraltar Airport Terminal? And my retort to that is that Spain sometimes doesn't understand how much damage she has done to the relationship that she had with the Gibraltarians, perhaps before even the First or Second World Wars. Institutionally, we have lost that confidence that we might have had a century ago. And it's impossible to see that even today, with incursions into BGTW, etc., we would see the agencies of the Spanish state as friendly. Look, I don't know whether future generations might see that. Certainly my generation, I don't think, would perceive that. And therefore, our position is that in 4 years' time, we should continue with Frontex. And if there is an insistence, if necessary, on the Spanish part, because there's a different government or because they simply feel that this is their position and they have to insist that they have to have Spanish officers in Gibraltar Airport or at the port, well, this Chief Minister will not be recommending that to the Gibraltar Parliament. The GSLP will not be recommending it to the Gibraltar Parliament, neither will the Liberal Party. party, and I believe that then it is right that we have preserved for Gibraltar the ability to terminate the treaty if that is the price of the treaty continuing in 4 years' time. I would rather see something that doesn't require that in 4 years' time, that sees the Frontex solution as one that is permanent, and look, if Spain can persuade a future generation of Gibraltarians to change from Frontex to Spain, it'll be a matter for a future generation of Gibraltarians, which I will be arguing against once I have breath in my body.
I think that we'll return to the issue of Frontex officers because it's one of the main talking points in this. But let's go to one of the next questions that were submitted in video form. And this is by the Cross Frontier group. And I'll just check my notes. The representative's name is Mar Sánchez del Río.
Transfronterizo, lo primero es agradecer al Gobierno de Gibraltar y al Gobierno de España la buena predisposición y voluntad política que han tenido para solucionar este grave problema que se nos ha presentado con la salida del Reino Unido de la Unión Europea y en la situación tan difícil en la que podemos quedar. La pregunta que desde el grupo nos podríamos hacer es si considera que este es el momento ideal para seguir potenciando lo que es la AECT, la Agrupación Europea de Cooperación Territorial, con la cual pues podríamos traer esa financiación a la zona que tanta falta nos haría para llevar a cabo pues muchísimos proyectos comunes y que nos llevaría a esa zona de prosperidad compartida. Muchísimas gracias.
Chief Minister.
So thank you to Mar and to the Cross Frontier Group for that question. In fact, for all of the work that they have done, they have really been supportive in difficult moments when the negotiation might have broken, etc. Let me quickly say that I continue to fully support the potential for this European territorial grouping. We have been supporting it from the minute that the Cross Frontier Group suggested it. We spent a lot of time ensuring that the legislation was there, that we analysed the statutes for this, etc. And we're very supportive. I think now is as good a time as any. You don't need to be establishing these groupings between two member states of the European Union. You can establish them between a third country, as Gibraltar will be, and a member state of the European Union. So I continue to be fully supportive. But in going through all of the detail that we're going through tonight and looking at the letter of the framework and speculating on the letter of the treaty, one of the things that we have failed to do, and we did it on the 31st and shortly thereafter, but I think we failed to do now, is to look more broadly at this also. And can I just thank the Cross Frontier Group for that broader approach, which is to say, look at what we were facing on the 31st of December, this hard Brexit. Look at the potential that there is now to recast the relationship in commercial and immigration terms between us and Spain. Look at the opportunities that creates, and look at the human reality that will produce, which will be much more positive. And can we just for one moment pause and think, actually, isn't this exactly the direction of travel that all of us have wanted for so long? Because Gibraltar has never been the aggressor here, and we mustn't fall into the trap of forgetting that. Gibraltar has always been wanting to have a normal and collaborative relationship with Spain. Spain has, in the past, slapped us away, except for the period which Sir Peter Caruana was able to achieve of a trilateral discussion and some agreement. Spain has always shunned us, told us that all they cared about was sovereignty. Now they're saying, look, we're ready to collaborate and we're ready to put sovereignty for one side. We mustn't fall into the trap of thinking that everything which is potentially positive about this relationship must be seen as not being a good thing because it comes from Spain. The things we don't like from Spain are the failure to treat us with respect, the failure to accept that we're a homogeneous people in Gibraltar, and the continued insistence on the sovereignty claim, etc. If those things can be put to one side, then let us also take the value of having that agreement. And I've said before, and I think I should say again, that González Laya, as Foreign Minister of Spain, has had a different sensitivity. Pedro Sánchez also has had a different sensitivity, and we do have to appreciate that, whilst rightly looking at the detail and dotting the I's and crossing the T's of this potential future treaty and looking carefully at the framework that we've agreed.
Daniel has a slightly more cynical take, if you like, on your phrase, shared prosperity. He says, does that really mean an increased prosperity for nearby Spain? And are the rainbows and opportunities in this arrangement really for them?
Well, I suppose that everything that we do in this region is shared. If you look at the GDP of the region, already in the Fletcher report, which the Chamber commissioned, I think some 7 or 8 years ago, I was already in government, 24% of the GDP of the region, I think from memory, comes from Gibraltar. But of course, a lot of Gibraltar's GDP is also very positively influenced by the ability to have people come into Gibraltar to work, the ability already that we have in a limited way of cooperating with the region. So I really don't think that we need to be cynical about how this prosperity will be shared. I think Gibraltar is the engine of prosperity here, but the people who come into Gibraltar to work, the facilities that there are in the area around Gibraltar, are as much the rocket fuel of this engine of prosperity that is Gibraltar as every single one of the Gibraltarians who work in our economy. Roughly, we've got 12,000 Gibraltarians working in our economy and 15,000+ cross-frontier workers. So we are all in this together, producing prosperity for all of us already. And the question is, if we take away some of those strictures, which we've always complained about, and the Gibraltarians have always complained about the frontier queues and how unfair it is that the frontiers used to strangle us economically, if you take that away, the failure to strangle us economically must mean the support for us to be even more prosperous, and for that prosperity to be not just for us, but for all those who work here and the industries around us.
So in some respects, the arrangement, as I think Sir Peter Caruana, for example, put it, is avoiding the harm of a hard Brexit. The benefits, if you like, are continuing with an arrangement that you say is working well for Gibraltar and is reciprocal, and avoiding a hard border which would interfere with the way our economy is currently structured.
Well, if you told me 9 years ago that I would support something that Sir Peter Caruana had said, I might have told you in my less mature political days that I would never imagine such a date. But look, he's absolutely expressed it in the right way. That is what this is about. But it's also about more than that, if I may. It's also about taking the relationship further in the economic dynamic that we might create. Because we've always thought, even when we were in the European Union, that if Spain were not so hell-bent on using the frontier to hurt us economically, we could do even more. And I've said before, on many occasions, in particular when Señor Margallo was in office, if we spent just 1/10 of the time that we spent attacking each other, jointly promoting this part of the world, we'd be bringing many more industries and many more companies here for the common good of the people who live here and around us.
A question from John, who said he's heard a lot of potential ifs, if it's possible, because I think he sort of understands that you're talking about a deal that you would like to reach but haven't yet reached. But he says, what about the more immediate term? What bridging arrangements are in place to make sure that we don't suffer surprises at the frontier or indeed in Spain with health insurance or anything of the sort?
So there's a number of arrangements already in place, but these are imperfect, and Spain are trying to get permission from the European Commission in some areas of European competence to continue to operate derogations, for example, from the Schengen border code at the Gibraltar frontier. Nobody from Gibraltar has had, as far as I've had reported, their passport stamped going into Spain. The Gibraltar ID card has been accepted, but people have been asked to have their passports on them in case they are found in the European Union without a passport and they need that passport for the purposes of having assistance, consular assistance, or having other assistance in Spain or in other member states of the European Union, because our Gibraltar ID card is presently not valid until the Commission has either accepted that in this interim period, or we agree that if we have a treaty in the treaty, which is one of our objectives. You'll see that one of the clauses of the framework talks about continued recognition of documentation. All of those things are difficult at this stage. You've seen, for example, that there are less difficulties already with foodstuffs coming into Gibraltar. Much of the problem that we're having with foodstuffs we're having in France at the Dover-Calais crossing rather than at the Spanish frontier with Gibraltar. So this is an imperfect science at this stage. And if people have problems, please, they should tell the government. That doesn't mean put it on social media. The government is not constantly looking at social media. Please inform the government directly at number 6 Common Place. Get in touch with my office or the office Office of the Deputy Chief Minister so that we can take this up with our counterparts in the Spanish Foreign Office to try and deal with these issues, these bridging measures. And my concern about bridging measures from the moment that the referendum result came in, and we knew that we were going to have not this framework and bridging to that, but that we were going to have transitional periods, etc., were the issues that we might not even be aware of. We've dealt with pet passports, but my nightmare was always somebody turns up with a problem with a pet, needs to take them to a vet or another vet, and there's a problem.
An unforeseen scenario.
An unforeseen scenario. So please do get in touch with us.
Okay. One more quick question and then a curveball before we take a short break. You mentioned Dover and Calais. Wilfred's asking, would the Schengen Treaty change the way that Gibraltar deals with immigrants?
So Gibraltar's asylum law continues to be respected, and there's a specific reference in the framework agreement to Gibraltar asylum provisions being dealt with in Gibraltar by Gibraltar agencies and therefore also by the Gibraltar courts. Our asylum law is going to stay the same. It's not going to change. It doesn't have to change. In fact, what you might say is that immigrants might spend even less time in Gibraltar because, given that they will be in Schengen, they will not want to be hanging around Gibraltar in order to get themselves further north if that is the way that they see themselves going.
And just before we take a break, Derek asks, Chief Minister, have you lied at any point to the people of Gibraltar in any shape or form in preparing this Brexit deal?
Never.
You're watching Viewpoint. We're discussing the New Year's Eve arrangement, the agreement in principle announced by the Chief Minister and the Spanish Foreign Secretary between the UK and the EU. They're working towards a treaty. It could happen in 6 months' time. We'll ask the Chief Minister more questions about it in part 2. Stay with us.